So Hoover had spent years staying out of people's lives, making sure the federal government didn't try to get involved, um, constantly championing this idea of free market capitalism that the economy was going to come right around and come right back. And it didn't work. So Roosevelt's going to come in and promise to use the federal government to help people. And that's going to be the major change from the 1920s to the 1930s and the Great Depression. And that's what the essence of this essential question is. And if you notice, same essential question is 4D. So let's talk about Roosevelt. Roosevelt promised a New Deal. And in his first New Deal, because there's going to be a second New Deal, but the first New Deal is going to be his experimentation to save American capitalism. Some people are going to claim Roosevelt is going to implement socialism, and that's just not true. Socialism is the idea that the federal government takes over all industries, right, and is what we call nationalized, where all of the government controls everything for business. And that's not what happens. Does the government move towards socialism and get more involved in people's lives? Sure, right? Some of the most popular programs in the United States today are based on this idea of social responsibility, right? Social security, kind of a socialism thing. Social security is where the government takes money and redistributes it to people that need it, like elderly retired people. So, but does that mean it's socialism? No. What Roosevelt does is try to save capitalism by experimenting and trying to put in some safeguards. And that's what the New Deal is all about. He's basically throwing all of these ideas at the wall, trying to see what sticks. Now, one of the things that he does in order to explain this plan to Americans is use a new technology called radio to directly address the people. This is one of the first times presidents did this. He's going to use the radio and he's going to talk to people directly. And it's kind of like you can sit around in your chair and you can have a fire and you can listen to the radio, and the president is talking directly to you. You don't need to read a newspaper. You don't have to hear it secondhand from some public figure. You can hear the president explain exactly what the plan is. And he tries to rally Americans and rebuild trust with the government, which had fallen apart under the Hoover administration. He's going to implement a policy based on Keynesian economics. And if you remember this from Chapel, right, we had Keynes, and his philosophy was that the government should deficit spend in order to create jobs and restart the economy. Now, what does deficit spending mean? It means the government is spending money that it doesn't have yet in order to purchase things in order to get the economy going again. Roosevelt called this priming the pump. Now, if you have no schema for this, if you have a well and if you just stick a tube into the well, and you doesn't matter how much you pump on that handle right there, no water is going to come up because there's no suction. So you actually have to put water into the tube so that it's touching the water in the well, and then once you pump, it'll pull the water up. So in order to prime the pump, you had to spend money in order to make money, right? That's deficit spending. The federal government can borrow money pretty easily and pretty cheaply, and the United States has a very good credit rating. So they can borrow money pretty easily and pay it off pretty easily. They just, once the economy gets going, what you're supposed to do in Keynesian economics is pay off the debt, and then the economy should take care of itself. Is that the way the government works? No, right? The government spends money when the economy's bad, and then people don't want to not spend money, right? Not only the politicians, but people like when the economy's going good, so the government continues to spend that money. That's the problem with the Keynesian economics, and that's why the deficit gets so high. So deficit spending money you don't have from year to year in order to create jobs and to restart the economy. And he's going to do a couple of other more radical things here too. First of all, he said one of the big problems was the banking system. In the first 100 days in office, right, this is the majority of his legislation came in the first 100 days when he was in office. One of the first things he did was tell the banks to close. It's called the bank holiday. Close off the banks, and then nobody can go and get their money out of the bank, and it stops the bank runs. He sends investigators into the banks, tries to figure out what banks were sound, which means were safe, and only those banks were allowed to reopen. Bad banks were closed. He also got Congress to pass the FDIC, or the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, which meant that up to a certain dollar amount, the government would protect your money, right? So if you made a bad choice and you put your money in a bank that was going to fail, right? Hoover said, that's on you. That's your bad choice. The government doesn't care. But what Roosevelt said was, it's important as a nation that we have sound banks. And if people are running to the banks and taking their money out, that means the banks are bad. So even if you made a bad choice, and even if you put your money in a bad bank, we're going to protect that choice, right? We're going to make sure that you don't fail, right? And that's going to help protect the banks, going to help the financial system, and it protects people. So the FDIC was created. Roosevelt also said, and the New Deal says, that one of the problems that caused the stock market crash, which deepened the Depression, was that those wealthy people were making such bad choices on Wall Street. They created the Securities and Exchange Commission, or the SEC, and that was designed to both limit stock market speculation, stop those wealthy people from gambling so much in the stock market and make them reinvest in their companies, pay their workers a better rate, right? And that's going to help safeguard people's savings, which were kind of tied up into the stock market. So both the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation and the Securities Exchange Commission were designed to help regulate the financial system. Roosevelt ends prohibition. There's two reasons for this. One, allow people to have something good in their lives again, right? The 18th Amendment caused it to be illegal to buy and own alcohol. The 21st Amendment ends that prohibition. Prohibition was hard to enforce. It led to a lot of organized crime. People were getting alcohol anyways. And Roosevelt says, we can legalize alcohol again. Then it starts off with small beer, very low alcohol percentage. And then eventually the prohibition ends. They can legalize beer and then tax it. People are going to buy the beer anyways. Now we can just collect a revenue off of that. And that's going to help, one, fight organized crime, and it's going to help help end political corruption, because now you can't bribe people with alcohol. And you can't, the politicians aren't getting rich by looking past organized crime, and the government gets a new revenue source. So any prohibition was important for the New Deal as well. He wants to fix the unemployment issue, right? People are starving. The people are struggling in the cities. They're relying on charity, which is falling apart. The states don't have enough money to provide any sort of employment. So the federal government is going to step in and try to put people to work. Now, he doesn't want to give people just direct checks. There was a little bit of that, but not a lot. They called it being on the dole. But he felt that men in particular and people want this dignity of working for their checks. So they created a lot of programs to put people to work. One was called FERA, the Federal Emergency Relief Administration. That was the one that gave out most of the direct payments. But again, not a lot of that. They created the Civil Works Administration, which built things like roads and bridges. The Works Progress Administration, they hired people to go out and do their jobs. So through the WPA, journalists went out and interviewed people and kept records, and it goes to the Library of Congress. Artists painted these beautiful murals. Sculptors made sculptures that would go on the buildings that they're building through the Public Works Administration. So they're hiring people to keep their skills intact, because they argued that just because the economy was bad didn't mean that we needed to lose all of our cultural institutions. The one that I really like is the Civilian Conservation Corps. This is the CCC right here. The CCC, or the Civilian Conservation Corps, hired young men from urban areas and then sent them to go work in the country. One thing that does is get those young, dumb men out of the city where they're causing problems and resorting to crime. So you get that population, the ones that are going to be the most problematic, away from the urban areas, get them into the countryside where they can be more easily monitored. You give them $1 a day or whatever. And what is interesting is about 90% of that money had to be sent back to their families. So you're giving payments to the families, you're providing food, shelter, and employment for the young men. And you're building infrastructure that's going to be incredibly important years into the future. We live in Myrtle Beach. The state parks that are along the coast, they were all built by these guys right here. Now, there are problems. If you notice in this picture, these are all white guys. So segregation was an issue. There were Black CCC members. I recently vacationed at Edisto Beach, which was built largely, that was down near Charleston, largely by a Black segregated CCC corps. So there are segregation problems, but there is at least an effort to help the Black population. Again, 50% unemployment there as well. A couple of the other first New Deal programs, again, just to give you an example of how much effort and money was put into this, the National Industrial Recovery Act was trying to help factories stay open. The Public Works Administration was building roads, dams, bridges, school buildings, hospitals. This is a housing project built by the PWA. You can see that on the sign. The school that I went to when I was in middle school was built by the PWA during the New Deal. So a lot of money went into building infrastructure that could be used in the future. The NRA, not the guns organization, but the National Recovery Act, was helping to set wages and regulate prices. Interestingly, this NRA was declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court, and that's going to trigger a pretty interesting response from Roosevelt in his second administration. We'll talk about that in a minute. Now here, we can see that not only is Roosevelt interested in helping the industrial sector, but also the agricultural sector. And if you remember going back to the 1920s, farmers had been struggling even before the Great Depression because of overproduction. So how do you affect overproduction? Well, you reduce production. And the problem with that, of course, is that means farmers aren't going to be making stuff, which means they're going to be out that income. So the government says, how do we lower production while still making sure the farmers survive? And they come up with the answer, the Agricultural Adjustment Act of 1933. They decided to subsidize farmers, to give them money to encourage a particular behavior. And the behavior they wanted to encourage was to make farmers not grow particular crops. You see right here, by having them not grow crops, that shifts the supply curve down, which increases the prices, right? Lower supply, increase price. The problem is that, especially in the South, there was a lot of sharecropping, and the sharecroppers paid their debts by growing things. And when the Agricultural Adjustment Act went into effect, the mostly black farmers that were sharecroppers were intentionally left out by southern state governments, right? They lobbied to make sure that those sharecroppers were not included in the Agricultural Adjustment Act. Why? Racism. But the landowners got the money. So those mostly white landowners that had employed the sharecroppers took the sharecroppers' land out of production, right? Continued to produce on their own land. So they got the landowners, this guy, right? This guy got money from growing the crops and selling them. And he got the money from the government to reduce the amount of supply. And who are the people that are hurt? Well, you look down here at the bottom, sharecroppers and tenant farmers. That's going to be a problem. Tennessee has the Tennessee Valley Authority. Tennessee was probably the most technologically behind state in the country, and it was suffering some of the most problems from unemployment. So the government created the Tennessee Valley Authority, which was going to use the federal government to make dams along the river up here, the Tennessee River. Now, if you look at this map above me, each one of those little red hash marks is a dam that was going to be built in Tennessee. That was going to provide electricity for the state. It's going to electrify rural areas. It's going to modernize the backcountry. It creates new demand for electrical products because now if you have electricity, you have to go out and buy stuff that's electrified. But it does make a lot of locals mad because the dams were flooding traditional home areas. Towns were flooded. People lost property. So while they're helping, it's also hurting a lot of people. Roosevelt was very popular because of his economic policies, but he was really kind of out of touch with the people. And his wife, Eleanor Roosevelt, becomes the heart of his administration. She supported women and African Americans throughout the New Deal, and she became the person that people wrote to when they were struggling to ask for help. Even after Roosevelt dies, Eleanor Roosevelt's going to go on to become a very strong advocate for women's rights, even serving at the UN. She supports women's rights throughout the administration and is really a strong advocate for African Americans during the administration as well. One of the reasons that African Americans start to transition to becoming supporters of the Democratic Party is because of Eleanor Roosevelt here. Now, this is Marian Anderson. Marian Anderson was a very popular singer during the Great Depression. She was a Black singer, and the Daughters of the American Revolution had used their power and clout to prevent her from performing in Washington, D.C. She wanted to perform at a desegregated location, I believe. And the Daughters of the American Revolution did not want that to happen. So Marian Anderson was out of a job, right? She couldn't perform there. She did lost that income. Eleanor Roosevelt heard about that, right? And worked with Marian Anderson to set up an open air concert in front of the Lincoln Memorial, which is a highly symbolic place for an African American singer to perform, right? Lincoln, the great emancipator, the person that was responsible for freeing the slaves, at least in the logic of that time. And Marian Anderson performs, and it became a very important moment in that cultural shift of African Americans to the Democratic Party. It is also not insignificant that the Lincoln Memorial is going to become the site of later the "I Have a Dream" speech for Martin Luther King. So the African American shift to the Democratic Party begins. We saw that with Eleanor Roosevelt. There are some weaknesses in the Democratic Party. Obviously, they don't do much to address Jim Crow. And the reason for that is because of the racism of the South. Franklin Roosevelt, as a national politician, needed to make sure that he had the votes in the South to get anything done. So you can't be too radical in your efforts, because then the Southern Democrats would not vote with the Democratic Party and nothing gets passed. So politics influences that as well. There is a problem that many of the New Deal programs were segregated. The Civilian Conservation Corps, for example, the TVA, skilled work only went to white workers. African Americans still get hired, but they got paid less and didn't get the good jobs. This is the Black Cabinet. It's a group of unofficial advisors that Franklin Roosevelt would talk to before he made a lot of decisions. So he did at least factor that into his choices. Franklin Roosevelt and the Democrats offered at least some aid and opportunities, at least a lot more than the Hoover administration, and definitely a lot more than throughout the 1920s with the return of laissez-faire. So the Democratic Party was at least trying to show that it cared, and that's where that transition from the African American population supporting Lincoln's party of Republicans is going to shift into that Democratic support. The Great Depression also has a lot of unfortunate side effects in that nativism increases even more than what it had been, right? You can see here in this cartoon, this is not a dumping ground. They didn't want immigrants to come to the United States because they were concerned that there was already not a lot of jobs here. They didn't want to compete for those jobs. Immigration quotas remained high throughout the Great Depression, even into the time where we see the Nazis really running up their biggest what's the word we want to call genocide of the Jewish refugees. Americans were still unwilling to support increased Jewish immigration, any great immigration at all, really. It's important to note that while the New Deal does not end the Great Depression, the World War II does end the Great Depression. But it's not because of the war, right? That's dumb. Wars don't fix economies. What ended the Great Depression was the massive government deficit spending that went into preparing for the war, right? We'll see here in a minute the spending. Roosevelt and the Keynesian economics had been arguing that you needed to deficit spend in order to kickstart the economy. The conservatives had refused to really buy into that and were trying to hold back the amount of spending, saying it was wasteful and was going to ruin the economy. When World War II happened and the United States had to prepare for war, had to start spending all of that money that it didn't have, deficit spending, it does fix the economy, right? So World War II does end the Great Depression, but it's because of the massive amount of government deficit spending. So let's talk about some of the critics, right? There was a lot of criticism of the New Deal. There's critics that are more liberal than Roosevelt, right? The left, and there's critics that are more conservative than Roosevelt, critics on the right. Now, let's start with the liberal critics. These are the people that wanted Roosevelt to do more. And this is like Huey Long. They called him the Kingfisher. He came up with a plan to share the wealth. He wanted to collect all the wealth over, I think it was $2,000 a year, right? And we said $3,000 a year was like $90,000 or so in 2021. So people making over, say, 70 grand this in the modern era, they'd have all of that wealth collected and it'd be redistributed to the poor people, right? Um, Again, unfeasible. There wouldn't be enough to distribute, but that's okay. Now, this guy here, Father Townshend, he came up with a plan to give elderly people $200 a month. And they would get $200 a month every month as long as they didn't have any money left in their account at the end of the month. So they had to go out and spend it. Again, a lot of stimulus spending. And then there's Father Coughlin. Townshend wasn't a father, sorry. Father Coughlin, he was promoting bimetallism, right? More inflation. So there's all of these plans from the liberals to try to fix the Great Depression, and most of them were an effort to get the government to spend more, do more. But then there's the conservative critics, right? Conservatives said that the government was doing too much, and this goes into their ideology of laissez-faire, right? That the government should leave the economy alone. The government is doing too much deficit spending, too much reliance on the government. The people would become too dependent on the government, and they would refuse to work later. There's a fear that the government is becoming socialist, that the country is going to fall apart. And I think it's really interesting that in the Great Depression, the 1930s, these arguments that the government is spending too much money, that people are going to become too dependent, and there's a fear that the government has become socialist and going to take over all the people's lives and all the economy. Those are the same arguments that conservatives use today at any time that the government tries to come up with a plan to help people. So interesting arguments there. Do you remember we said that the NRA was declared unconstitutional? Well, that made Roosevelt pretty nervous. And when he got reelected, he was worried that the Supreme Court was going to start overturning other New Deal initiatives. Remember, Supreme Court justices serve for life, right? So the same justices that are on the court in his first term are on the court in his second term as well. So Roosevelt wanted to fix this idea of the Supreme Court. He wants to protect the New Deal. So he comes up with a plan that's often referred to as the court packing scheme. And in this, he looked at the Supreme Court. There's 9 judges on the Supreme Court. 6 of them were over the age of 70. So he argued that because 6 of them were over the age of 70, they were pretty slow, they took a lot of time, and the New Deal was a rapidly changing thing. So he wanted to be able to process these things a lot faster. So he asked the Congress to add 6 new justices to the Supreme Court. And the Constitution doesn't say how many justices are on the Supreme Court. We've had anywhere between 5 and 9 at any given time. The problem was Roosevelt was blatantly trying to grab the Supreme Court here, because who gets to appoint these 6 new justices? That would be Roosevelt. And here's Roosevelt here, right? You can tell Roosevelt because of the big chin and the little glasses and the weird smile, right? So you get Roosevelt asking for 6 new justices, and what's the only qualification for these new judges? To say yes to New Deal programs. Even liberal critics criticize Roosevelt for this, and the plan falls apart. It does not happen. But the Supreme Court justices knew how serious he was, and they stopped overturning New Deal programs. Once he takes office, Roosevelt decides to listen to his critics on the right, the conservatives. And he gets reelected here in 1937, right? Or 1936, I'm sorry. You can see the unemployment rates going down, 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 down. He gets reelected in 36. And then he decides to pull back on some of the spending. And what happens in 1937? Immediately, you see a rise in unemployment again in 1938. Because of that immediate rise in unemployment, he blames that on this removal of government deficit spending, removal of government protections, and then he shifts to liberal criticisms. And we call this the Second New Deal. And in 1938, he reopens a bunch of plans and starts trying new things, which are going to keep the unemployment rate going down, 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 down until 1940, 1941, when the United States starts planning for World War II. One of the big second New Deal programs was the Wagner Act and the Fair Labor Standards Act. These 2 programs put together protected unions and helped with collective bargaining. Remember that from Unit 3. It's protecting unions. Remember that for the Wagner Act and the Fair Labor Standards Act. It's helping to protect wages and helping to protect workers' rights. One of the most popular programs in the United States, even today, is the Social Security Act. giving money, and this sounds an awful lot like the Townshend Plan, giving money to elderly, disabled, and unemployed people to make sure that they can pay their bills. This tax is passed on to workers, which is the downside of the Social Security Act. Workers would get money taken out of their check each month, and then when they retire, they would expect to get that Social Security money back. So they're taking monies from the workers and shifting it over to these aged, disabled, and unemployed people. So what's the legacy of the New Deal? Well, Franklin Roosevelt gets the unions, courts meaning gets the unions, and African Americans from the North into the Democratic Party. Southern Democrats begin to distance themselves from Franklin Roosevelt. They didn't like all the support of African Americans that Roosevelt was showing. So Southern Democrats are starting to shift away. And we're going to see that after World War II, those Southern Democrats are going to break away from the Democratic Party, mostly because they didn't like all of the positive civil rights moves that the Democratic Party was making. There's a belief that the government should respond to economic crises, mostly through deficit spending and Keynesian economics, right? And the government takes more responsibility for helping people, not just promoting big business, not just trying to promote laissez-faire policies, but actually getting involved in people's lives and becoming more impactful that way. And this is a mentality that still impacts the United States. We still have a lot of New Deal programs that are in place, like the Social Security Act and the Securities and Exchange Commission. Roosevelt's second term does align with what we're going to see in Unit 5, which is the growing threat in Europe as World War II begins. And you can see here, this is Hitler walking over the spineless leaders of democracy. So the United States begins to prepare for World War II as a result of that. And that's going to be the thing that helps kickstart the economy and all that deficit spending that leads to the end of the Great Depression.